All right, we've got Jay here. Let's bring Jay in. All right.
Yo, what's up?
I've got Jay in the purple room. Hey, what's up?
Thank you guys for bringing me on. I appreciate that. I didn't mean to be annoying. I mean, it's y'all's show. Of course, you don't have to bring me on, but I appreciate it.
I always appreciate having Pastor Randy Bowles on here.
Well, I'm here to set y'all straight because, of course, we all worship Jesus, even if we don't know him, if we just come down to the monster truck rally this weekend at my mega church.
Truckapillar versus Fordzilla. I used to watch those commercials.
Yeah.
All right, so we got this poll up, ladies and gentlemen. Jay, our audience is clearly biased in favor of the idea that Christians and Muslims do not worship the same God.
Well, I think you were right when you said that the polls could reflect a lot of Protestant perspectives. And I have to say that the Protestants have been pretty spot on this one versus the Catholics, because all the Protestants I've seen, for the most part, have the correct take that it's pretty clearly, intuitively, just not the case that it's the same deity being, quote, worshipped. And then, like you said, there could be some, ortho bros as well in the polls. But there's just something I think innately confusing about the idea that it is the same God, given how different the theology is. So I think, and you guys probably already touched on this, but the question was worship. And in Orthodox theology, particularly, worship is not just mental assent. And so there was a constant equivocation going on between the idea of mental referent or abstract conceptual pointing at or intending a thing versus the worship of the thing. And that's why it was very important to talk about the magisterial statements of the Roman Catholic Church in terms of how they're supposed to view it. Because remember, Roman Catholicism does have a lot of intellectual schools. You got Thomists, you've got Scotus, etc. But ultimately, it's supposed to be guided by the magisterium. And that's kind of what I came to debate. We were going to split it between FDA and I. I would take the magisterial side, and then FDA took the linguistic philosophy and epistemology side of it. But to be more specific about FDA, he's working from a paper by a guy named Dr. Garraby. And the reason he's relevant is that both Garraby and Dr. Trent had studied under Swinburne. And it's Swinburne, who is a Thomist, who came up with this idea that there's a rational core doctrine of what makes up natural theology's idea of the essential core attributes of identifying the one God. And so Garraby argued that in his paper, if you could demonstrate that there is no rational core, then the whole natural theology project falls apart. And one of the arguments that he makes, there's many, it's a pretty long paper. It's really good. I recommend anybody read it. But one of the arguments that he makes is that you kind of assume from the outset what's in question if you think that, oh, well, of course, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all have the same core doctrine because they all believe in a monotheistic, omnipotent, omnipresent, etc. You start listing these omnis and so forth: eternal, free, good, creator, personal, etc. But the problem is that, first of all, some of these attributes don't actually apply to Allah, not at least in the way that the Orthodox conception of them or even the Roman Catholic conception of them eventually fleshes them out. For example, Allah, when we talk about Allah as a creator, well, in the Quran, Allah is also the creator of evil. Evil seems to have a kind of an actual substantial existence. So even the notion of what a creator is in Islam is kind of already right there, very different from what it is in Christianity, or perhaps Judaism. You have this idea that God desires to be worshipped and obeyed. But what that means to worship and obey, this is one of Swinburne's core doctrines for natural theology, is very, very different. In Islam, it's a submission to a kind of Arab warlord version of a deity. And in Christianity, it's worship involving sacrifice. Islam does not have a notion of sacrifice. And so that's why I kept pointing out that if the premise of the debate is how, or the question of worship, do they worship the same God? Constantly through the debate, you would hear, and I've heard Roman Catholics ever since, just going back to this idea that, well, Muslims assent to the mental notion of there being one God. But the debate was not just about sense and referent or abstract conceptual pointing at and intending a thing. It was about worship. And God specifically is worshiped through sacrifice, whether we want that or think that. And Islam notoriously doesn't have that. So, ironically, Protestantism, which does admit the sacrifice of Christ, is much closer to our position as Orthodox. You could argue even Judaism, perhaps, than the Islamic conception, which is further removed on the question of worship, because you would have to restrict the whole debate and the idea of worship to an assent to propositions. And in the Thomistic conception, I'm not saying that they don't believe that worship is about sacrifice or the Mass or whatever, or Christ. They do. But if you ask a Thomist or Roman Catholic, like, what is the faith? Usually it's cashed out as assenting to the propositions that the magisterium proposes for belief. So that's what the faith is. And so their idea is, if you can get a Muslim to assent to this proposition, this proposition, this proposition, this one in common, then aren't we referring to the same entity? And you absolutely were spot on, David, in the way that you described the argument that FDA is presenting there, that because God's more like an abstract object, not that he is, but he's more like that than a sort of an empirical natural object, that to get one thing wrong is enough to disqualify the referent. Whereas in empirical objects, you could conceivably get multiple things wrong and still be referring to and intending the same object. But God is more like something like a set. I'm not saying that God is a set, but even the argument that we have a core set of doctrines, I mean, for an Orthodox Christian, triad would be a core doctrine. So it's very odd that triad is God being Trinity, or God also being God the Son. Right? It's odd that that would not be an essential core identifier or thing that picks out this referent. And I think you would have to go in that direction to argue it. And I think they just never did really establish that. And last thing I'll say, I don't mean to keep rambling. I know this is y'all's show. I don't mean to barge in, but when he talked about something like a conjunct or a set, FDA was basically just saying that if you think about, say, the Nicene Creed, or something like the way that God is described in the Creed, I believe in one God the Father, and then it talks about the Trinity, right? That's kind of a set that you could say defines the Christian conception of the deity of God. And even though a Muslim might assent to or agree to certain propositions like eternal and God is omniscient or whatever, although you could actually argue that, because Ibn Taymiyyah argues that God isn't omniscient. The Quran speaks of Allah updating his knowledge and kind of being limited. So I'm not even sure you could argue that Allah is omniscient. But regardless, it's more like a set of things. So if you had a set of numbers, right, 1 to 6, and if I just take out one of those numbers, even though there's the other 5 still in common, it's actually a different set because I've taken away one of the numbers of the set. And so he's arguing that the way that we define God or speak of God is more like that than it is like an empirical object like Clark Kent and Superman that you could be confused over. And so when you remove those essential attributes, even if it's one essential attribute, it actually fails to obtain hitting the referent. And that's FDA's argument. So the other thing that Garibay points out is that it's kind of like, and this is more in the domain of the critique of natural theology, is it's kind of like a card game. He says, if you think about playing Go Fish, and then if you think about playing poker, between the two, there's a lot of things in common. There's cards, there's rules, there's strategies, there's techniques, etc., betting or whatever. But there's no common card game between the two card games just because there's a bunch of things in common. They're mutually exclusive, unique sets of games that are determined by the rules and structures of that game. And so if you start taking away rules, it's, even if you take away one rule, well, it's no longer poker. It's no longer Go Fish. The game is pretty much kind of spoiled at that point. And that's, I think, what FDA was trying to argue.
Did they, I I don't know what the response to that would be, because the examples that people give when they want to say, hey, you can have completely different, even contradictory descriptions and still be referring to the same thing. And then him saying, yes, in this world where you have other means of knowing that you're talking about the same thing, you can say we're talking about the same thing, even if we're describing it differently or in a contradictory fashion. And him saying, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about something where, oh, here's how we know we're talking about the same thing. We've got your idea or what your creed or whatever. And so if yours is different, that's what you got to go on. And so you're not talking about the same thing. Did they respond to that?
Yeah, what I recall is that the response is because they come from a perspective of empirical theology. And I'm not saying they're empiricists, but Thomistic philosophy and theology is very empirically based. And so from them, the perspective is that the only things that you do know about God, whether it's the natural revelation that you get through causation in the natural world and reasoning back to the original cause, or whether it's the text that you read in Scripture, they're all empirical. And so you're really just sort of piecing together from created causation things that you can derive about this ultimate principle. So there's natural revelation or natural theology, and then supernatural theology from Scripture and tradition in the Roman Catholic system. So, but for them, they would not, I don't think they would grant the argument that God is more like an abstract object and not a natural object, because their theology kind of prioritizes God like a natural object.
One question that I have, Jay, I think there's also something like this, I think came up. I didn't watch the whole debate, but I think I saw a clip or something like that. But somebody might argue that the way it is qualified that Muslims would not be described as worshiping the same God because they get certain core aspects wrong. Wouldn't it jeopardize, or wouldn't this also be in some way or the other applied to, for example, from the Orthodox view to Catholics or others who, for example, hold the idea of the filioque, or to Orthodox or to Oriental Orthodox Christians, for example, who have even if you want to reduce it to semantics, who have a different description of the nature of Christ, for example.
Yeah, and I just someone raised up the. I just wanted to put it on the screen there because we got the same thing. But Heisenberger, actually, I can put these in the middle and they don't block people. Heisenberger here said something pretty similar. Considering FDA's argument, couldn't certain Christians not be considered worshiping the same God since their exact mental views of God are different? And even further, as I was pointing out earlier, I mean, you would have millions of Christians who believed in some sort of differences in terms of things God has done or how God created or something like this. So wouldn't that mean that we're all worshiping different gods, basically?
Yeah, this is actually, in both of you guys' questions, you actually anticipate where the debate goes. So the next section of the debate ends up being about knowing God through sort of empirical data. And they end up debating about the Eucharist because FDA argues, well, don't you also as a Catholic believe that you are empirically encountering God in the Eucharist because you believe that it's body, blood, soul, and divinity? And that becomes a really interesting kind of detour because they end up saying as Thomists, not really, even though they do believe in the real presence in the Eucharist. It just kind of goes weird. I'll put it that way. You can determine for yourself how you think that section goes. But then the debate goes to this question, and they press FDA on this. Well, wouldn't this mean then, if you have a heterodox conception of the deity, that would also then kind of negate it, and it would be basically another kind of false god or idol? And actually, we would argue as Orthodox that yes, in the traditional patristic argumentation, at least in the Orthodox Church, and what you see in people like St. Gregory Palamas has a really good discussion of how heresy creates a kind of a mental idol that is the replacement fake god. So an idol doesn't have to be, a statue of the thuggy cult Kali or whatever, like in Temple of Doom. An idol can also be a kind of a mental conception that is an idol. Idolatry, you could say. So yeah, actually, FDA argues that. But to be really clear here, that doesn't mean that everybody who's got something wrong is a heretic, because in our theology and anthropology, we would also say that heresy is something that is not so much a sin of knowledge as it is mainly a sin of obstinacy and will. So you have to be obstinate in the rejection of truth to be a specifically a heretic. And that's why you see, for example, when Basil is writing against the Arians, who are basically Jehovah's Witnesses, or even basically proto-Muslims, because the Oxford Handbook of Islam says that Islam comes out of Arian Christianity. Even the Arians, Basil says, have essentially erected a false god. So it's no longer the same referent, even though they might intend to be worshiping the one true God. If I think a rock, is the one true God, or the Kaaba, or so, if I think a rock is the one true God and I worship it as the one true God, like, it's not me accidentally worshiping Jesus or the Trinity, because it's still an idol. And so you can also have a heterodox conceptual idol as well. Now, we don't know men's hearts. God only knows men's hearts. And so we can't sit here and like judge every single individual Protestant. But a person who obstinately persists creates their own kind of idol.
This is what I meant earlier when I said that that within the Orthodox theology, the discussion here generally seems to be focused much more on something deeper than about what can be on the surface, or legally be said to be true, or what could be considered appropriate. For example, what I'm trying to say is, when Father Deacon Ananias made his point here, it seems to really bring forth the difference in what the Orthodox side is actually talking about and what the Catholic side is actually talking about. So the two seem to have a completely different understanding of what it actually means to worship God in a sense. So the Catholic side simply says, well, if they direct themselves toward our God in one way or another, and say that they do, then to us they worship God. Whereas in the Orthodox, in the Orthodox perspective, it goes much further than that in order to be qualified as worshiping the same God, because you have to.
I think you nailed it right there. When you said meta earlier, you said it's like it's holistic versus the kind of like bottom up, like the Roman Catholic project is kind of like a bottom up. Mm-hmm. And then the other perspective is just holistic. So I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that's why we have the Eastern Orthodox Protestant Brotherhood Alliance.
on this issue, it's weird because, like, for so many years you hear, oh, the Catholics and the Protestants are so close. I mean, Catholics and Orthodox are so close, and then it's like this comes up in the last few days. It's like,
we will humiliate everyone.
Protestants are like, we're on the same page. It's crazy.
Wouldn't you say that this is also one of the grievances that Protestants have had historically with the Catholic Church, and which kind of developed to this level as well, where the Catholic Church went a little bit far in terms of scholasticism and legalism, and defining everything with 100% rationality, and not letting it go unless you can totally rationally define it. And Christian theology is generally a little bit different from that.
Yeah, like Aquinas, it's almost like by the Middle Ages, they want a kind of a scientific definition of when exactly within the Mass the confecting of the Eucharist actually occurs. And it's like, how are you going to scientifically define that? It's like, in the Orthodox conception, it's like there's no scientific like, oh, it's at this point, and then if you scale it down, this is the essence of the Mass. And I mean, that's literally, so that in Roman Catholicism, you have matter, form, and intention, and all of those are necessary to have a sacrament. So it's very, like you said, it's very scientific, or at least it tries to be. And yeah, absolutely. Like the paradigms determine even things like the worship. Like we wouldn't restrict worship to merely mental assent. And I'm not saying that they restrict it to that, but in order for this argument to work, that Muslims and Christians worship the same God, worship has to be restricted to mental assent to God is one, God is eternal. But wait a minute. Worship is, according to, the book of John and the book of First John, like directed to the Son, who directs us to the Father, and it's in the Holy Spirit. So you can't really divorce this Trinitarian relationship from worship in the Christian scheme, and that's what you would have to do to retool this idea that, well, they're not worshiping the Trinity or Christ, but they're worshiping these sort of like abstracted attributes over here. But in Orthodox Trinitarian theology, like there's no attributes that come to you from the essence of God that aren't Trinitarian attributes. So Basil says, for example, that all the energies that come down, or the attributes or operations that come down to us from God, come to us in the mode of from the Father through the Son and in the Spirit. So the attributes are in the mode of the triad from where they come. So there could never be attributes divorced from or understood, abstracted from God as triad. And once I read Losky saying that, I read Losky saying that a long time ago when I was still Roman Catholic, and I was like, whoa, I never thought about that. And Losky's like not just an Orthodox dude, like he studied under Etienne Gilson, who was like the premier Thomist. So you had somebody studying under the top Thomist who became, a very famous Orthodox theologian. And so he knew Thomism very well to critique it. And that kind of transformed this whole discussion of natural theology for me.
So this is why you could basically say that if you don't,
Hey, Pete. Oh yeah, 1 second. I don't know how long everyone wants to go. I'm good all night long, but I'm dying of thirst and I need some more beverage. So you guys go ahead and chat for a second while I grab some water.
Okay. So this is why. Now I forgot my thought. This is why. So this is why you would say that if unless you have the right, unless you know God truly through the revelation, through the way he reveals himself, and therefore then establish correct worship, as you just described it, you could describe any other form of worship as idolatry, whether deliberate or not.
Yeah, St. John Damascus wrote a book called On Heresies. And he goes back to the very beginning in Genesis, and he says, when Adam and Eve fell, that's the beginning of paganism and idolatry. And he says that's the original heresy. And he argues that Satan is a kind of heretic. So basically, even all the world religions could generally be classed as heresies. And so that, I think, ties into this notion that you're saying right there. Like if you look at Romans 1, the way that a Roman Catholic or a Thomist would usually explain Romans 1, where Paul's talking about the pagan world, Roman Catholics usually exegete that as kind of like the highest elements of pagan society, like Plato and Aristotle, were able to sort of reason from the created order to a principle, first principle, a monad, a first cause, or something like that. But in the Orthodox perspective, it's more so like if you read St. Gregory of Palamas on it, it's like, no. It's not a problem in their intellect. It's a problem in their heart or their nous. So Paul says that they exchanged the worship and love of the true God, going back to Adam and Eve, for universal idolatry. And Paul says in verse 25 that they changed the truth about God into a lie and worshiped and served the creature, not the creator. So that's specifically saying that when you go after false gods, like Deuteronomy 13 says, or Deuteronomy 18, God warns the Israelites. He says, do not go after other gods or else you're no longer worshiping me, right? In the Song of Moses says that they sacrificed to devils, to gods they didn't know, and they forsook the God they did know, the one true God. So we would argue that those are texts kind of making the same point. Like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, he says, the things that the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And so every heresy, every false religion is basically making a fundamental mistake in not worshiping God the way that he has to be worshipped according to the Ten Commandments.
Wow.
And I would say this is actually a very Hebrew principle. This is like, for example,
Jay, your camera went out, buddy.
Oh, it's my battery died on my. Yeah, I'll fix that in just a second. But yeah, I think it's it's a Hebrew idea that, like, it's not all intellect. It's actually more of a heart problem. And this is what I tried to stress in the debate too, is like, it's not really an error in reasoning. It's more so a spiritual kind of a heart issue.
Uh-huh.
I liked, yeah. So it seems like there's kind of two different arguments running. One is kind of more of a relational one, and more is like understanding the attributes of God. But you're kind of blending them though with the idea of worship in Eastern Orthodox. But I really like the first argument where you're talking about just the intuition of how this doesn't seem like the same God, because intuition is a huge part of language. And really, what we're arguing about is like what this term God, how it should be used. And the idea that you were talking about putting it into a story, and I had that same contention where, like, the way we'll understand God is in a story. And in the Christian story, he's worshipped with sacrifice and with love, and he's wanting this loving relationship, and that's so completely different. And so um, it would be like knowing a person in my normal life and they just get so many facts completely wrong about me. At what point do I just say they don't know anything about me? Where
Yeah.
it's like they they think that I want them to go out and kill people so that they can sleep with houris for all eternity. It's like, at what point do you just say that they just don't have any knowledge of me?
Yeah, and again, even knowing, you could equivocate on that, because in the passage in John 4 with the woman at the well, Saint Fotini, right? Jesus is talking to her, and he says very specifically that you do worship this thing, this idea that you have of the God of Jacob, but you don't know it. So there has to be some kind of knowledge in order for her to, quote, worship, but it's not a true knowledge. And this is where in scripture you'll find pretty consistently, both Old and New Testament, two different notions of know, right? Like Adam knew his wife Eve, that's an intimacy, that's an intimate knowing. And that's the true kind of knowing that we're talking about here, knowing God in a true loving way, love and adoration way, versus what James says about the demons who know God, but do not love God and cannot love God, right? And I think the best argument that actually ended up being made on my side of things in the debate was the topic of Jake. When Jake came up, I pointed out that, and I think this is a key point that you guys will definitely understand. And the reason this is resonating with people like David and AP very well in terms of not agreeing that it's the same deity being worshipped is because you guys know Islam. The people that we're talking about, I don't think they actually know much about Islam, because, for example, Tomaszewski, he didn't seem to know much about it at all, especially not the history of he thought that the Middle Ages was the early period of Islam. No. Medieval popes were already into a well-developed, warfare-based movement and religion on the part of Islam. It wasn't early. And so what that means then is that if you understand that Islam, for example, rejects that God is Father, Allah is not Father and has no sons, then you can't even say that it's the same referent of the God of the Old Testament anymore, because that would be one of the fundamental things that, say, a Jew or ancient Hebrew would say. Well, Yahweh is our Father. And if a Muslim is from the outset saying that Islam is predicated on rejecting the Trinity and rejecting the deity of Christ, then the religion is not like a pagan. Even if I granted natural theology and we were talking about a pagan who's out in the middle of nowhere and he happens to reason from the created order that there must be some first thing, that is not what Islam is. Islam is already a religion that has some knowledge of Christianity and explicitly rejects it. So that's why it was so, I think, damning to point out Jake the Muslim metaphysician, because Jake used to be in our Discord for many years, and he acted as if he was interested in Orthodox Christianity and all this. And really what he was doing was just learning what our theology was, right? So when Jake had a very, I would say, pretty advanced idea of what we believe the Trinity is and the deity of Christ and all that, I would say amongst the Muslims, I think he's kind of kooky, but he probably understands the Trinity better than all the other Muslims.
Yeah.
But he explicitly rejects and does not at all love God, the Trinity, or love Jesus. So the idea that he's still worshiping the same deity just is patently absurd. and they affirmed that in the debate. And I think that was probably the weakest point. And I think people are noticing that just makes absolutely no sense. Jake knows a lot about the Trinity, but he doesn't know the Trinity in a loving, intimate sense. And that's exactly what happens with the woman at the well. Jesus says, the Samaritan conceptions that you have, they might be of a God, but it's not the one that the Jews have, because salvation is of the Jews. And that's very important, because that restricts the conception and the worship to a specific way. And that's the point.
Well, they're just so drastically different, it gets ridiculous. It's, you either have to say it's two different gods, or you have to say the word God basically does not mean anything at all. That's
and at that point, you would be at the position like perennialism or something, or you would be at this position like, well, all religions then are just unknowingly worshiping God. And some of the some of the post-Vatican II statements actually do say that. In fact, I found one today, and it was actually Lofton that was making this point. So props to Michael Lofton, because I mean, there's post-Vatican II documents I've got right here that say that basically the Holy Spirit is operating in Islam and other religions to save people in the religions.
That can be true, but they're still not the same God, you know. And I think even a Muslim might have an earnest prayer that they're trying to get to Allah, and God would hear it and take it as a prayer coming to him. But that does not mean that the God of Allah is the true God of, you know, that created creation.
Well, I think, again, like, even if you did, like, as Orthodox, we might say that the Holy Spirit could reach anybody, and anybody could be given a revelation of Christ. We've heard, you know, for example, many Muslims these stories have been going around for a long time, that Muslims sometimes have dreams and Christ comes to them and they learn that Islam is false. So that's definitely possible, but that's still some kind of specific, like, revelation of the person of Christ. And even in the Roman Catholic Church, this is interesting. I've found this in Denzinger, and I think it's very pertinent to this discussion. You can go back to the 1700s in the Roman Catholic Church, and there were certain doctrines that were considered, quote, absolutely necessary to receive, quote, the faith and baptism. One of those was, according to the Holy Office under Pope Clement in the 1700s, you had to, quote, admit, this is for the baptism of Muslims or Mohammedans. If a Muslim or Mohammedan wanted to be baptized, the response of the Holy Office is that they must first be told the Trinity and the Incarnation, the two, quote, central doctrines of the faith. And then there's another question, a proposition that comes up earlier in the 1600s in Denzinger. Is faith in just one God necessary, or must there be also the confession of God as the rewarder and belief in the Trinity and the Incarnation? So Rome, at least at one point, did not think that having the faith was merely having some assent to the idea of a generic creator. It was also necessary to profess the Trinity and the Incarnation to receive baptism, and thus to receive the Catholic faith.
Jay, have you ever read I spoke about this earlier during the stream, but the Declaration Dominus Jesus, published in 2000 by the Catholic Church, approved by John Paul II. It seems to, I don't know, I haven't read the whole thing through. I've only looked at certain parts of it. I want to go through it, but it seems to actually kind of disagree and contradict with the idea that these that Cameron or Trent or the other guy were presenting, and it seems to actually elaborate on the position of the Catholic Church, and seems to say that they don't actually properly worship, or that they don't actually worship the same God, that they actually lack the assent to God. So I don't know. I have to watch the whole debate to see how that fits in. But just wondering.
It's a great question. I haven't actually thought about this document since I used to be a trad cat. So I'm not even sure. I'm looking at it now. I don't remember exactly what all's going on, but I would just simply say that when I was looking at a lot of the medieval texts and the medieval councils, you especially have that one from Fourth Lateran Council. No, Council of Vienna, excuse me. Council of Vienna is the one that said that the Muslims adore their reprobate, faithless prophet Muhammad, who is, and then he was also called Antichrist earlier on by Innocent III. And it's like, I mean, just look at the change of language, right? Like between if you're Antichrist, which is consistent with First John talking about how if you don't confess Christ coming in the flesh as divine Son of God, you are spirit of Antichrist, versus this idea that, well, you know, we're all kind of on a spectrum, and, you know, maybe you worship God 60%, but the Catholic Church worships God 100%. It's like, you either do or you don't. Like, I mean, you can have false conceptions, but in terms of what defines worship, I think you're going to, my point is simply that the Catholic Church has said a lot of different things. And so you can kind of paste onto it what you want. Like, if you want to be like Mother Teresa, where you can go into Hindu shrines and pray, which she actually did on record. If that's what you think Catholicism is, it can be that for you. If you think it's medieval crusaders following Innocent III to fight Antichrist Muhammad, you can make it into that. So there's enough documentation to kind of like paste together the type of Roman Catholic system that you want. And that's, I think, both a strength and a weakness. I don't think it's true, but it's a strength because a lot of people can find ammo to make it what they want. But it's also a weakness because at a certain point, it's like, what exactly is Roman Catholicism? Is it calling a crusade, multiple crusades for many centuries, to fight against the godless race of the heathen Saracen Muslims?
That's
Or
exactly
is it,
that's right.
or is it Pachamama, like we're praying, you know, to this human sacrifice idol, and we're going to, and notice it's the same argument. The argument for why Pachamama is okay is like, well, but it's kind of like Mary. Okay, but like every action, I mean, satanic abuse, right, or something like that. Like if I human sacrifice, and if I'm in the Thuggee cult, we watch Temple of Doom. Well, there's some sacrifice going on. They have a liturgy, right? There's a priest. So there's some things in common. So like, what's wrong with it? That was like when they did the Pachamama thing. Like, there was actually Roman Catholics who were arguing it's okay because it's kind of like Mary. She's a goddess and she, you know, likes to be honored and, you know, whatever. It's like, but no, it doesn't work like that. Like, it's not a thing where it's acceptable because there's some things that are similar. It's like there's a specific way that God has always been worshipped, and it can't be mixed with the ways that the gods of the nations are worshipped.
Mm-hmm.
So they might both be like necessary beings, but I don't think it helps because it feels immoral to me, because it would be like, you know, calling God, saying that he's affirming everything Muhammad did, sleeping with kids, mass murder. So it would be like if I said, you know, Jay Dyer is a mass murderer, and the mass murderer Jay Dyer that I'm thinking up has to be the same guy, because the real Jay Dyer and the one I'm thinking are both human. It's like, just because your conception of God is a necessary being doesn't mean it's the same God.
Exactly.
And it feels immoral to attribute the horrible actions of Allah to God. It feels like satanic to me. It feels very
He's the greatest of deceivers, right?
Yeah, the counterpoint. I'm making this argument as well, and I also posted about this earlier when I made a list of how the Islamic God is different from the Christian, from our understanding of God. While I can talk about the moral differences and how the Islamic God is completely morally messed up, the counterpoint that Catholics in this discussion, for example, would bring up probably is that they can have a completely warped, completely messed up understanding of God while still turning toward the same God, and therefore being described as worshiping that same God from their perspective. But then again, we have to have a long discussion about what do you mean by worship.
Yeah, I think this. Yeah, I mean, God can draw and does draw anybody at all times who's sincere and sincerely seeks him. You know, Paul says this in Acts 17 when he's talking to the pagan philosopher, you know, the Greeks and everybody. And he says, you know, God has set the times and the seasons and the nations, and, you know, arranged providence such that if anyone should seek out, right, that he might be found. So I think God does meet us where we are, but we don't conclude from that, I don't think, that therefore anything counts as getting you to that referent. And I mean, I just think that the weight of the evidence in so many passages is just, the only thing I can think of that even kind of speaks this way is Romans 1. But even that, I think, is the heart being darkened. And Paul specifically says they exchange the worship of the true God for darkness, and they're in pagan darkness. So even though they might get some things right, it's sort of like, I mean, there's a great critique that Father Seraphim Rose has of Hinduism in the book, Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. And he says the push for the sort of ecumenist one world religion movement is first premised on the idea that, well, many of the religions believe in one God. And he says, but if you look at the way that the Hindus conceive of that one God, and by the way, Vatican II in Nostra Aetate actually says Hindus have a flight to God, capital G, in love and trust. So it almost acknowledges like Shakti, which is a version of Hinduism, which is, quote, monotheistic. And it's like, but I mean, saying that you're monotheistic, but also having this like pantheon of other deities and a kind of henotheism. I mean, at this point, anything can be monotheistic. You see, it can be so broad as to encompass. I mean, there's theistic Satanists, right? There's people who worship.
Yeah, even the demons believe. Yeah,
exactly. The Temple of Set believes there's one God. He created everything. He sustains everything. I don't know about all the other attributes, but and they say, but it's Set. It's the Set of Egyptian theology, which is the Satan of the Jewish, Hebrew, Christian Bible. So would we conclude then that, as these people do in the debate, that they're like, yeah, it's still worshiping the Trinity. It's like, that's still accidentally. It's just ludicrous to me.
Yeah.
Especially if it's a religion premised on rejecting the Trinity and the deity of Christ. I think that's the hardest thing for them to really get over. Because Jesus says, Jesus says it in John 5, John 8, and then in 1 John 2, it says, if you don't have Son, you don't have the Father.
So we were all kind of visibly confused when, I keep forgetting his name, but the second Catholic speaker, when he...
Tomaszewski.
Yeah, when he said that that they wouldn't qualify everything as worshiping the same God. For example, he wouldn't
Mormons.
describe Mormons as worshiping the same God, and we were all a little bit confused about that, because it seemed from Trent Doherty's reasoning that Mormonism would have to be described as worshiping the same God as well. And from everything else that they described, let's leave aside all the implications of Mormon theology and how we can describe that Mormon theology results in actually worshiping an infinite number of gods that are kind of in a loop, or whatever you want to call it. They do claim to worship the God of Abraham, and they do claim to be monotheistic. They do claim to. It does emerge within the context of the Bible narrative and so on. So it seems rather arbitrary that they would say, we don't qualify Mormonism as worshiping the same God.
Exactly. And this is that point of that core doctrine thing. It's like, okay, so what's the core doctrine? Oh, well, it's clearly Richard Swinburne's 9 or 10 list. Okay, but if we're going to include the Mormons like Dr. Trent does, then it can't be that 10 list, because the Mormons miss about half of those, right? Because God the Father is a man with a body who's created and who evolved to become God. That's the official Mormon doctrine for those that don't know. Matter is also eternal. So God is not, when a Mormon says creator, it's the architect rearranging existing prima materia. They do not believe that God created matter. Matter is also eternal in Mormonism. So they believe in many principles, and so it is fundamentally polytheistic, even though a Mormon says our one God, though, is God the Father, who's a dude, just a dude, right? So it's like, well, so does that count as mono? So in other words, it's arbitrary, exactly. So for Dr. Trent, Mormons make the cut. For Tomaszewski, because he's a Thomist, Mormons do not make the cut. They don't get enough of the, quote, essential attributes.
And then even when coming up with a list, there's, to include Islam, he had to be kind of arbitrary by not including like God is triune or something like that. And so that's kind of the issue with you. If you're going to say, hey, if you if you have this on your list, then you're in, and if you don't have this list, then you're out. Well, who's making the list here? Who's making the list? And you could easily add one thing and rule out Muslims, and you could easily take off a few, and then you get Mormons back in there, and so on. And so, yeah, Trent's argument basically, I don't even understand how Trent's argument would rule out polytheists. I mentioned this earlier. Like, as
the debate progresses, he actually says that if you worship, he says literally that you can worship God and demons at the same time. So he makes this argument that, he says that because Israelites, for example, at one point were including Yahweh amongst the pantheon, they were worshiping demons and Yahweh. And so he was arguing that, so Muslims are worshiping, even if they got it wrong, even it's still the same, but that's not the same. And that's the point is that when God castigates the Israelites, again, this is where the golden calf comes in as a great example. It's like, no, you can't say the golden, well, here's your Yahweh. Here's this, golden calf right here. Right. I mean, it just doesn't work.
It would be like sleeping around with a bunch of people and then being like, but I'm still married to my wife, which is actually, that's the metaphor that the prophet, remember the Old Testament. Yeah.
Exactly.
Prostitute. Yeah.
Wild stuff. You guys have more stuff you want to talk about, or should I jump into some super chats?
This is the issue that I just want to go back to that point just for a second again. This is the issue where, I mean, when Trent says that you can worship demons and also worship God, and that you are worshiping the same God, and to you and to us, this is then of course completely unacceptable. This once again brings to the surface the whole difference of the two perspectives. As I said, the meta which we are arguing about versus the very surface level worship that they are talking about.
Yeah, last thing, I don't want to take too much of y'all's time. I appreciate you having me on. Last thing I would say is just, and I'll let you guys move on and finish the debate. But I was so a lot of them were using this analogy of like, okay, so look, like let's say there's Superman, there's Clark Kent, and you can get the reference wrong, but it's still the same. But this was funny because in this, if you use the Superman story, this doesn't really work very well because Superman is actually Kal-El, right? So he's actually this sort of deity that's tricking people with two different identities that aren't really who he is, right? Some people know him as Superman, but some people know him as Kal-El or as Clark Kent, but he's actually Kal. So this analogy that they kept wanting to go back to actually works to disprove the position, because it means that basically the true God is sort of like hiding amongst the different religions, right? And you don't actually, you're actually worshiping him, but you don't know it, even though you think you're worshiping, Kali. It's actually, I mean, so that analogy I don't think worked very good for them. And I thought of a better analogy. I'll leave you guys with this. Here's my last analogy for how I think this really works. And I'm going to say it's the Bill Cosby analogy. So let's say that people think that Bill Cosby is the great American comedian. It's 1978.
It's America's dad.
Dude. Yeah, right. Even though this is not true, but let's just say that Bill Cosby is like the premier comedian in 1978. And these group of clever marketers come up with this idea that, no, actually, didn't you know, the whole time, the real source of the comedy was his cousin, Charlie Cosby. And he's the real funny man. In fact, he's 10 times funnier. And here, look at all these posters we've got. And doesn't it look like him? It's his cousin. And they just took pictures of Bill Cosby and they tweaked it a little bit with 1978 Photoshop, whatever that was. And they put a hat on him, and he's still got all the same feeble fobble, zeeble zobble jokes and ha ha ha. And they sell the tickets $100 to sell out the stadium, and people come. Turns out there is no Charlie Cosby. It was a gimmick, and it's a fraud. It's a fake. There was only Bill Cosby the whole time, but these demonic marketers came up with this clever con or this clever scam. And that is, I think, the key point that you guys understand, because you know Islam so well. Most of the Roman Catholics that we're talking about in this sphere, except for perhaps Shamoun, who has seemingly completely changed his position on this, by the way, they don't actually know what Islam teaches. And I didn't know 10 years ago. I thought, oh, Islam's very similar. You know, they think there's one God. But once you really get into Islam and see how different it is, then you see it's just kind of silly to say this. And the Bill Cosby, fake Charlie Cosby scam, I think is a much better analogy. And after you debate the Muslims a bunch, as you guys have a million times more than me, like you realize this is a retcon, as you said perfectly. That's the way better. It's a scam. It's like, you know, a fake, you know, blue market special and Kmart version of something versus the original. That's a better description than the Superman Clark Kent analogy.
Well, the funny thing is, both of the analogies that you just gave, the whole Superman analogy and also the Bill Cosby analogy, would actually totally make sense and point toward a true God if Allah was the true God, considering that Allah is a deceiver. Works perfect.
Hey, your sound went.
It's a deception. It's a con. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not. We're all looking at the same thing, trying to kind of see through the fog and figure out what it was. It's like there's this one true thing, and then there's these con men copies of it.
Yep.
Hey, I think you could actually. I think you could use someone else for the Bill Cosby thing because remember Gallagher? I think he had like a twin brother or something like that who used to tour as him. But I mean, you might be able to like.
Oh, he smashes cantaloupes. It's way better than smashing watermelons. You got to see.
I forget the story because this was a long time ago, but I think Gallagher eventually had to like sue his brother for stealing his act and pretending to be him because he's still Gallagher, right? That was his name too. So I think it was something like that. You could actually, because there you actually had someone who was a different person who was nevertheless imitating.
What did he like rip him off and he tried to do the same type of stuff?
I forget the details, but I think he would also tour as like Gallagher and stuff like that. And then he's like, wait a minute, you can't.
That's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Back when I did criminal law, my partner had a case where the client was saying, no, it was my twin brother that did the crime. Turned out actually his twin brother really did do the crime and he got arrested for it.
John McRae has a twin brother. He said that was just natural if one of them got in trouble. No, that was my brother, and you couldn't tell who did it, so you didn't get in trouble.